Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet, rate them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Facial Hair and Horns, written by Captain Candy. I am reading this log in an admittedly confused state. Our human crew member, Stephen, has recently disappeared. He was always quite a quiet, laid-back fellow. He would laugh and joke with the rest of the crew and smile wider than anybody. At times he was a bit quiet or reserved, but his calm head always saved our asses when encountered. When crap hit the fan, as he would say it, he never panicked like the rest of us. He always got really calm, found a path out for anyone involved. Recently, though, one of our crew seems to have angered him, though I don't think anger is the right word. Rather, Stephen seems calm like he always was in those panic-inducing incidents. A crew member jeered at Stephen about his inability to grow facial hair, something previously joked about, and Stephen would always just laugh it off and say it was a bad joke and that he'd heard it enough times. This time, when it was said, he reacted very differently. He was working on a plasma pump for the engine when the remark was made, and he put down the pump part and rag that he was cleaning it off with. He silently, without a word, placed down his gloves, took a deep breath, and went to leave the room. Before he left the room, all he'd said was, "That's it, I'm done." He did not yell, nor did he show any normal human indicators of anger. His eyes did not narrow, his veins did not bulge, and his skin tone remained constant. But the crew member who made the remark, Keith, a fellow mantid, gave his statement earlier. He told me that after he made the joke, Stephen went from jovial and laughing to deathly silent and calm, like an ocean that was full of waves one moment, and then like a glass mirror the next. I was told that when this shift happened, the air itself seemed to stop circulating, and the room temperature seemed to have dropped by several degrees. Keith said that every alarm instinct that our species has developed over millions of years went off all at the same time, screaming at him to run, to hide, to cower, to freeze, to camouflage, to do something, just to get away. He said it was as though Stephen had suddenly turned into a ruthless, emotionless predator in an instant, like some switch had been flipped. After that, Stephen just vanished. Nobody saw where he went, and nobody has any clue where he may have gone. I've looked this up in Galactic Net, and there are other reports of similar behavior from the other humans. The end results are never good in these reports, however, so I hope that this is simply Stephen having gone someplace to relax. End log. 2 weeks later, Galactic News. Breaking news! Galactic humanitarian crisis has been called for the mantid species. A new odd disease has occurred on their planet, making it so that the males of the species are no longer capable of growing out horns on their heads. While these horns serve little purpose in modern society, they are a symbol of pride and style for most males of the species. This disease is only affecting this part of the mantid biology for some reason, and the males that have already grown horns are having them fall off. This disease has only just appeared, but has affected an estimated 13% of mantid species as a whole already. We will continue covering information about this odd disease as more information comes up. Please consider donating on our official galactic website for research into this odd illness. 2 hours later. Well, Stephen came back today with much more level head and apologized for abruptly leaving us weeks ago without a word. Given with his work ethic before, and the fact that getting a human engineer is harder than finding a needle in a damn gas giant these days, I forgave everything. He is now happily back as part of the crew as if nothing ever happened, with the exception the fact that Keith caught that odd sickness making males hornless and unable to grow new ones. Though, on a personal note, he seems far more, interesting without them. At the same time in the engineering quarters. "Oh, Keith, what happened? You can't grow some facial horns, Your face looks so bland without them." Such a damn shame," Stephen said in a sing-song mocking voice that seemed to spit venom. Upon hearing this, Keith looked at Stephen in absolute terror, as it suddenly clicked in his mind where his human compatriot had gone for 2 weeks. Keith stammered, You did this? It was you who made this abominable disease because I made some damn jokes about your facial hair. Do you have any idea how many lives you've harmed for this petty revenge?" Stephen shook his head and said, What's the matter? Are my jokes not funny? Do they hurt your pride? Does it sting knowing that you can't be a normal male and grow horns? See, Keith, this is what we humans call silent rage. I told you to stop with the jokes directly, indirectly, and every way I could fucking fathom. But you just wouldn't stop. And I know the captain wouldn't take my little complaint as anything seriously. Just some jokes amongst the crew. So I took some time off to visit a manted homeworld. Lovely this time of year, might I add. While I was there, I might have decided to practice a different field of engineering, specifically bioengineering. Now, maybe 1 or 2 samples of my work got out, but who's to say? I was in such a fit of rage I simply forgot where I might have placed them. While saying all of this, a smile crept out in Stephen's face that would make the devil's own blood run cold, and his eyes reflect an evil glint as he continued. Now, Keith, how about you don't mock my facial hair, and I don't mock your horn problem, okay? Let's start over and get along in the future, shall we? End of story. Story number 2, Forgiveness, written by whizkeylullaby. Railsign pulled his hood over his ears and kept his face low. The war between humans and elves had only been over for 6 months, and there were some still strong anti-elf sentiments in many human countries. Railsign could hardly blame them. His homeland had started the conflict, demanding concessions of land and assured of their superiority. What followed was nearly a decade of slaughter. He himself had thought of humans as insects until just over a year ago. Blinded by propaganda and arrogance, he'd joined the Mage Corps to earn a name and titles, to become a hero. How distant those days were. The war had not gone the way that they were promised. Neither side won, fighting over the same ruined dirt and empty cities over and again. That had been his life, going from trench to trench, throwing all of his mana in as many elements as he could, spewing fire, electricity, and hurricane winds. Before long, he'd felt like a weapon, not a person. He fought on, hiding the realities of his crimes behind blind faith in his leaders and their lies. Then, he'd been wounded, left in a muddy shell crater among the dead. Then a human fell into the crater with him. He and the human had locked eyes, and while Railsign had reached for a knife, he found the human approaching with a bandage and a canteen. "Drink," he said, in such a heavily accented Elvish that Railsign had to hear it once more to be sure. The man was sharing his water. Railsign had been thirsty, his lips chapped and throat parched from hours of laying in the muck. The human then began to bandage him, giving a reassuring grin and a nod. Then, a shout in Elvish and the crack of a rifle. The human cried out, slumping over Railsign, and, for the first time, the elf looked into the face of his enemy and truly saw him. A boy, less than 1/10 of his age, perhaps a man to the humans, but a child to the long-lived elves. He'd been rescued then, pulled out of the muck by his fellows, and sent home to recover. And shortly after came the ceasefire. Railsign had taken something, though, the human satchel. He'd spent his recovery studying the tongues of various human nations, trying to understand the letters and words in the documents the human had in his effects. Finally, he understood enough. A name, Molliger Jarek. Then the tears came, and he read the letters. Jarek was married recently. His child had been born not 3 months prior. His wedding ring sat in the satchel, along with his grandfather's stopwatch, a family heirloom. Railsign wept. No longer were the human faceless, murderous monsters. The lies he had told himself had crumbled. The lies he had been told shattered. He resolved himself then. He would travel to the address on this letter and return Jarek's effects to his family, and take whatever punishment they could inflict. Honor, if he had any left, demanded it. Now he found himself outside a small home, a far cry from the grand architecture of his people, but somehow warmer, cozier. He knocked, swallowing hard. A woman answered, dressed in mourning clothes, with a baby on her hip. Railsign pulled back his hood, and in halting Tesseract said, "I'm sorry. Your husband died saving my life. He was shot because of me." He braced, closing his eyes and squaring his shoulders, holding out a satchel, everything put into place, as well as a hefty satchel of gold. It would not begin to cover his debt, and perhaps it could ensure Jarek's son's future. Railsign was ready for blows, for shouting, even to be killed. He was entirely unready to be enveloped in a soft embrace, nor to hear the words, "Thank you." He looked up into the teary green eyes of the woman. He offered a fragile smile as she grasped his hand and led him inside. Then there he shared as best he could his encounter with Jarek, as his widow listened. His composure crumbled, and this gentle woman comforted him and said words he'd not known he yearned to hear. "It is not your fault." He wept like a child, in the arms of a woman less than a tenth of his age. He spent the night there, at the insistence of the widow, and when he left, the world seemed brighter, like a veil had been lifted. The war still weighed on him, but forgiveness had given him the strength to continue onwards. Railsign would look over Jarek's family, using his power to help them, becoming something like an uncle to the dead man's son. He would also use his status as a war hero and a noble to influence diplomacy and relations between men and elves, hoping that as long as he lived, there would never be a repeat of this tragedy. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Asrigal. Thank you very much.